We can measure the physical properties of our rock and mineral samples, and by measuring those physical properties, we can learn a little bit more about them and also help us to identify unknown specimens. A scientist by the name of Frederick Mohs developed the Mohs hardness scale, and that measures the hardness of minerals. The hardness of minerals is just another way to say its ability to resist scratching. So the harder a mineral, the more it is able to resist scratching. Mohs hardness scale is listed here. He found 10 minerals and he associated a different hardness with each of those. And as we read this scale, a hardness of 1 is actually our softest minerals, and we work our way up the scale to a hardness level of 10, which would be our hardest minerals. Those would be the ones that are most resistant to scratching. So if you take a look in the Advancing Science rock kits, you'll notice that rock samples or mineral samples 1 through 9 actually match up with Mohs hardness scale. So number 1 in our kits is talc, number 2 is gypsum, and so on. And if you take a look at those first couple specimens and compare them to specimens 7, 8, and 9, you'll notice a big hardness difference. And we can actually measure that difference using some common objects. And so here are some common household objects that match up with the Mohs hardness scale. So our fingernail has a hardness of about 2 to 2.5. A copper penny has a hardness of about 3, and so on. And we'll use some of these common tools to test the hardness of our samples. You'll need 4 tools to do that. The first is your fingernail. If you can scratch a rock with your fingernail, that means that the rock or mineral has a hardness of less than 2. If you can scratch it with a penny, that means the mineral sample has a hardness of 3 to 4. With a nail, between 4 and 5. Or if you can scratch the glass plate with the sample, then the sample has a hardness of greater than or equal to 6. So let's take a minute to look at how this test is done. To test the samples, you always start with your fingernail first. So we always want to start with the softest item first to see if it will scratch our rock or mineral sample. So in this first picture here, we're trying with our fingernail to scratch the rock sample. If we were successful by scratching the sample with our fingernail, then we would stop there because our test is complete and we would know that our sample has a hardness of less than 2. But if we were not able to scratch our sample, then we would move on to using the penny, and we would use the penny to try and scratch the sample. If we're able to scratch the sample with the penny, then our test is complete. We would record our data as this sample having a hardness of between 3 and 4. If we are still not able to scratch our sample, we move on to the nail. And we hold the rock here in our hand, use the nail to try and scratch the rock. If we were successful in getting the nail to scratch the rock, we can say that this rock has a hardness of between 4 and 5. And if we were able to scratch the rock, then we are done with the test. However, if we still were not able to scratch the rock, then we take our glass plate. Put the glass plate on your work surface, hold it carefully between your fingers, and use the rock to try and scratch along the glass plate. If you're able to scratch the glass plate with the rock, we could say that the rock or mineral sample has a hardness of greater than or equal to 6. So it's important to remember that these steps have to be completed in order. You always have to start with the fingernail, then to the penny, then the nail, and then the glass plate. However, it's also important to remember to stop when you have successfully scratched the mineral. So if you successfully scratch the rock or mineral with your fingernail, you stop there. You do not proceed to use the penny, the nail, and the glass plate. Only proceed all the way up through these steps if you still have not scratched the sample. How we use the Mohs hardness scale to find the hardness of our rock and mineral samples. Again, the hardness is the ability of that mineral or rock sample to resist being scratched. Another physical test that we can do to learn a little bit more about our rock and mineral samples is called a streak test. And a streak test is used to find out the color of the mineral in its powdered form. Sometimes when you look at a sample, it may look one color, but the streak or the powder that it produces may actually look a little different than what you see in the sample that you're looking at in your hand. But that streak will always be the same for the same type of mineral. So we take a streak plate. We have two different kinds of streak plates. One is black and one is white. They work exactly the same way. It's just that some colors will show up better on the black plate and some colors will show up better on the white plate. Now the streak plate has a hardness of about 6.5 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. So this only works for rocks and minerals that have a hardness of less than 7. Anything harder than 7 on the Mohs hardness scale will just scratch the plate. It won't actually leave behind a streak of powder, so you won't be able to tell its streak color if it's a really hard sample. To use the streak plates, place the streak plate on your table, hold it between your fingers, and then just drag your rock or mineral sample across the plate, and you'll look at the color that's left behind. If you were not able to see the color that was left behind on the streak plate, you could always try the opposite color plate. But you can also double check on the Mohs hardness scale. Remember, if you have a really hard rock sample, if it's a 7, 8, or 9, or 10, it's just going to scratch the glass plate, or excuse me, the streak plate, and it's not going to leave behind that powder. So these are two simple physical tests that you can perform on your rock and mineral samples to learn a little bit more about their properties, and also it can help you to identify different samples.